What is up guys, this is Luke Hill for KitGuru, and in this one we're examining a couple of DDR4 4GHz memory kits from Klevv, which is effectively the retail arm of memory chip giant SK Hynix. So the two memory kits we've got, number one is the Bolt XR, which is effectively a commodity memory kit if you like, so no fancy RGB lighting or ridiculously tall heat spreader, which is ideal for users with oversized CPU coolers, I might add. And then we've also got the CRAS XR RGB, which is a little bit more flash, and it has, of course, an RGB light bar along the top. That's the brief introduction, so now let's see what these two 4GHz 16GB kits from Klevv can offer, and we'll have a closer look. But before we do that, if you like what we do here at KitGuru, make sure you give us a like and subscribe on the YouTube channel, that really helps us out. Check out the full written review on the KitGuru website, that supports us massively too. And make sure you interact with us through Discord, Twitter and the likes. And buy a cool t-shirt like this one on our merch store if you want. Let's get back into it. Starting off with the two kits, which are fundamentally the same as far as specifications go. We're running a DDR4 4000MHz, and both of them support XMP. They're dual channel 2x8GB 16GB kits, and they are using single rank 8GB modules. The timings are 19, 25, 25, 45, and that's at 1.4 volts operation voltage. And the underlying memory ICs are SK Hynix DJR in the aforementioned single rank 8GB module configuration. Looking at the Bolt XR first of all, Klevv uses an aluminium heat spreader that is somewhat gunmetal grey in terms of appearance and is clearly notched and grooved to just basically add a little bit of artistic flair rather than just being a flat aluminium plate, which quite frankly would be quite boring, but perfectly sufficient for low power DDR4 modules. And then around the top of the modules, we've got a thicker, somewhat oval section which adds a little bit of contrast and holds the name Klevv Bolt XR. So overall, this is clearly nothing fancy in terms of aesthetic design for the heat spreader and the module itself. I would compare the Bolt XR to something like Corsair Vengeance LPX, where they're basically just commodity memory modules with a basic functional heat spreader and not oversized in any form. So that's particularly good if you just, number one, don't care what your memory looks like and you want good value commodity memory without spending extra for a fancy heat spreader or RGB lighting. And it's also good when it comes to CPU cooler compatibility if you've got a large air cooler which can interfere with DDR4 modules. And that interference point is clearly a strength for the Bolt XR because these measure in at about 37mm tall, which is really not bad. And for comparison, something like Corsair Vengeance LPX, if I just grab one of those sticks, is about 33.5mm tall. So the Klevv modules are slightly higher when it comes to interference possibility, but they're all pretty low profile. The 4GHz CL19 kit that we're testing, so 16GB kit, comes in at about £130 in the UK, and that's on Amazon and some sellers on eBay because availability is very limited, it seems. £130 puts Klevv's Bolt XR kit directly against the Corsair Vengeance LPX competitor for the same frequency and the same module capacity. If we now focus on the CRAS XR RGB memory sticks, which of course run at the same settings, the key difference are clearly the heat spreader designs and therefore the actual module design itself. Klevv still uses an aluminium heat spreader, but this time the design is changed to kind of a dotted pattern instead of the notch and groove pattern that we see with the Bolt XR. One other point I will note is that the color is actually slightly different to the Bolt XR modules. So where they were clearly a gunmetal grey in my opinion, this actually has more of a... It's difficult to explain, but it has more of a purpley rose gold tint to the actual module colouring, which is certainly unique. I haven't really seen this before. I quite like it, but of course that is individual preference, and the contrast between the somewhat rose gold type grey, we're going to call it, and the black glossy finish on the top of the heat spreader before getting to the light bar, that does look good in my opinion. I do like the contrast there. Module height is now 42.5mm due to the inclusion of the RGB light bar, but as far as RGB memory modules go, 42.5mm is actually really good. So if we compare to the Vengeance RGB Pro SL, you can see that Klevv's kit is slightly smaller by about 1.5 to 2mm. And then if we compare to the Patriot Viper Steel RGB, you can see that Klevv's kit again is notably smaller. So that's going to be really important if you have a large oversized air cooler or a case with some compatibility issues for top fans. Focusing on the RGB lighting, I'd say that the overall quality is strong. We get good lighting from this wraparound LED top bar, which has kind of an oval type structure to it. And that's quite unique in my opinion when it comes to the light kind of design that it gives off, rather than a solid strip light bar that we typically see on many competing modules. So I do quite like that aesthetic touch from Klevv. One other benefit of this oval style light bar is that it gives the illusion of giving off more light and more LEDs than it realistically does from a solid light bar, and that's of course because you've got the contrast to the unlit centerline section. The light brightness is good and the underlying LEDs are not clear to the point where light diffusion is a glaringly obvious problem. Basically what I'm saying there is that the lighting smoothness is good and I don't really have any concern or quite frankly any care of how many RGB LEDs that Klevv has positioned in this module because I'm happy with the smoothness. Versus something like Corsair's Vengeance RGB Pro SL, I'd say that the lighting from the Klevv module is not quite as bright and perhaps not quite as smooth as Corsair's mainstream go-to modules, but this is quite a tough competitor for the Klevv CRAS XR RGB sticks. One area where Klevv does improve versus Corsair though is with the diffusion between colours for that wraparound light bar. I personally just feel that because of the way the light bar is designed with the centerline that isn't lit, the diffusion and the blending between colours was preferential in my opinion and on my personal preference compared to the solid light bar of something like Vengeance RGB Pro. Control of the RGB LED lighting is left to the tools provided by your manufacturer of other hardware, so of course that's going to be your motherboard vendor in general. And this in my opinion is a big strength because I never want to download another piece of software to control more RGB lighting tools. Price is around £145 on Amazon in the UK, with availability similar to the Bolt XR, so quite limited to basically Amazon or some third-party eBay sellers. Anyway, I think that's a close enough look at both of Klevv's memory kits, so let's jump on into the test system and the test results. Testing for the Klevv 4GHz memory modules is done on our AMD Zen 3 platform, and that uses a Ryzen 9 5950X processor overclocked to 4.6 GHz static. The motherboard of choice is an ASUS ROG Crosshair 8 Hero, and we use a Gigabyte RTX 3080 Eagle OC graphics card for gaming power. By default on AMD, 4000MHz memory kits like this will deliver a 2000MHz memory clock and therefore 1000MHz memory controller clock from the CPU, so basically a 2-to-1 divider. If, however, we can get the fabric clock overclocked to match that memory clock, so 2 GHz, we can then run the memory controller clock at 1-to-1 with the memory clock and the fabric clock. Unfortunately, our 5950X just doesn't want to go above 1900MHz fabric clock, so that is our limitation when it comes to running the memory controller clock at the 1-to-1 preferential mode. This means that we have two test procedures for these 4 GHz memory kits. So first off, we're running at 4 GHz XMP with nothing changed in the system other than, of course, the Ryzen 9 5950X overclocked to 4.6 GHz. This runs the processor at 1.8 GHz fabric clock, 1000MHz memory controller clock, and of course 2000MHz memory clock to give you 4 GHz DDR4. We also test with a more tuned setup for actual memory performance from the CPU perspective. So in our case, that's running at 1900MHz fabric clock on the chip, 1900MHz memory controller clock, so 1-to-1 and no 2-to-1 divider latency penalty, and also 1900MHz on the memory clock, therefore 3800MHz actual DDR4 frequency. So yes, this is a slight underclock versus the 4 GHz XMP, but we're interested to see what the performance will be, because that is one of the benefits of 4 GHz plus memory modules on Zen 3. You get the flexibility to run the fabric clock higher if your processor can take it, while still keeping the memory well in spec for what it's rated for. A big positive there. One other point I must note though is that for some reason our ASUS motherboard just didn't like the CL19 XMP profile. It would actually tune in 19 and then would run at 20, which was annoying. So to make this a little bit more fair, I actually tuned it down to CL18, which was perfectly stable at the stock voltage of 1.4 volts. So technically, yes, that's an overclock, but it was stable, so whatever. We've got a few comparison kits, primarily DDR4 3600 with a range of timings and a range of capacities, some single rank, some dual rank. Our most interesting comparison is going to be our recent memory that we tested, which is the Corsair Vengeance Pro RGB SL, and that's a 2x16GB capacity DDR4 3600MHz memory kit. However, it's using single rank DDR4 memory modules, so that should be quite comparable from a rank setup when it comes to these single rank 8GB Klevv modules. And then we can look at some of the differences that frequency has on the actual performance. That's going to be an interesting comparison, so let's get into it. And of course, as always, if you want more details, head on over to the written page on the KitGuru website. Thanks in large to its single rank IC configuration, Klevv's 4GHz and 3800MHz setups cannot compete with the higher capacity dual rank kits in 7-zip compression. Corsair's single rank 3600MHz Vengeance RGB Pro SL modules are outperformed by Klevv's faster set though, provided capacity differences are not a concern. 7-zip decompression is more favourable on the 3800MHz setup with Klevv's kit compared to the out-of-the-box 4000MHz configuration, which drops to bottom place. This is thanks to the improved memory controller performance for the 1900MHz fabric clock and memory controller clock configuration at DDR4 3800. Blender is also best on the 3800MHz setting, whereby Klevv modules match higher capacity and tighter latency Patriot sets. The 4000MHz out-of-the-box setting is left towards the chart bottom, joining Corsair's single-rank 3600MHz modules. Cinebench again does well with a 1900MHz F-clock and U-clock benefit of the 3800MHz DDR4 mode on Klevv. This once again highlights the benefits that higher speed memory, through increased fabric clock flexibility, can bring. 4000MHz mode on Klevv with the slower memory controller clock still manages to outperform Corsair's chart bottomer. Raw memory bandwidth in Sandra prefers the 3800MHz mode, as the 4000MHz configuration shows little improvement over Corsair's 3600MHz stick. Ada's memory bandwidth test switches up the picture and this time has the Klevv kit at the chart top thanks to their higher operational DDR4 frequencies. This test does not seem to care for memory controller clock speed deficits. Improvements to the memory controller clock speed help latency in Ada, as shown by the chart top in 3800MHz Klevv configuration. Conversely, the 2-to-1 divider for the CPU's memory controller imparts a huge latency penalty when running the Klevv kit at 4GHz mode out of the box. 3D Mark Time Spy continues the same trend that we saw from CPU-based performance tests. The 3800 configuration proves beneficial, and the 4000 setting with Klevv DDR4 is almost matching Corsair's single rank sticks. Shadow of the Tomb Raider shows the same trend, but the 4GHz memory mode for Klevv roughly matches the technically lower clock but tighter timing Corsair set. In terms of overclocking, we actually had a very good deal of success from the Klevv CRAS XR RGB modules. With the stock-ish timings of 18, 25, 25, 45 retained, the processor operating under XMP conditions for the fabric clock and memory controller clock, and the voltage bumped up to 1.45 volts, we first focused on frequency performance. This presented us with a 4400MHz peak from the 4GHz rated kit, which is an impressive 10% improvement. Any higher than that would not post on our motherboard though. And when we switched focus to looking at the timings, we stuck with the preferential 3800MHz DRAM frequency, allowing for the 1900MHz fabric clock and 1900MHz memory controller clock, and we again bumped the voltage up to 1.45 volts for the DRAM. This presented us with timings of 18, 19, 19, 45 as our best result, and that does represent an impressive improvement over the stock 19, 25, 25, 45 timings, albeit at 4GHz for those stock XMP timings versus the 3800MHz for our improved timings. Put simply, our overclocking results are very impressive indeed. With good frequency gains or good timings tightening possibility, we certainly cannot argue with the overclocking results from the Hynix DJR ICs in the Klevv kit. The performance from Klevv's 4000MHz 16GB memory kits is reasonable enough and generally trades blows with DDR4 3600MHz memory with tighter latency, provided it's in single rank IC form. Initially, this may sound like a rather underwhelming result for a 4GHz kit, But our testing with the Klevv kits effectively downclocked to 3800 MHz, but with preferential fabric clock and controller clock settings, shows the performance improvements available if you're happy to tweak the CPU side of things. And that's where Klevv's kit with this 4000 MHz rated stable frequency comes in beneficial versus DDR4 3600. You can now tune your CPU up to 1900 MHz fabric and memory clock, or 2000 MHz fabric and memory controller clock if it can do it. That's where the flexibility comes in, because you've got a memory kit that can push to those higher memory clock frequencies that opens up the flexibility for the Ryzen CPU with known stability on the memory. And that's a positive versus DDR4 3600, which on the face of it is cheaper and looks to be roughly similar performance. That's not really the case when you tune these higher spec memory kits with the CPU in tandem. CRAS XR RGB has a good lighting system with solid software control depending upon your motherboard vendor's software. But of course, it doesn't need its own software utility, which, in my opinion, and I'm sure many other people's opinion, is a big positive for a memory kit. The brightness and the smoothness of the RGB LED lighting is nearing Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro levels, so that's actually really strong praise for Klevv's modules. And the oval style light bar is unique and will appeal to many, especially when it allows maintaining of that tolerable 42.5mm module height. Bolt XR is a commodity style memory kit comparable to Corsair's Vengeance LPX, and it serves a purpose if you want no frills DDR4 memory without paying excess for fancy heat spreaders and lighting. Neither of these 4000 MHz 16 gig memory kits is really priced in DDR4 3600 MHz 32 GB dual rank territory, and that's a good thing because that's a battle that Klevv just doesn't want to get into. The CRAS XR RGB is, in my opinion, the best buy out of the two when looking at the market positioning. £145 for a 4 GHz kit of this caliber is actually quite reasonable, particularly when comparisons versus the similarly priced Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro are apt. And notable competitors from Crucial and G.Skill tend to be priced a little bit higher, albeit with sometimes tighter timings. If you really want to go for a cheaper set, you're going to likely be limited to ADATA or Thermaltake, so I'm actually pretty okay with Klevv's market positioning and pricing, given the quality of the lighting from the XR RGB modules and the overall performance that we saw. The Bolt XR feels a little on the high-priced side, at around about £130 in the UK. That is because Patriot, for example, offers a Viper Steel 4 GHz 16 GB kit at around about £100 to £110 in the UK, and that is a tough competitor. And you can also get some slightly higher speed kits around the sub £130 mark with a slightly flashier design, so from the likes of ADATA or Thermaltake in particular. With that said, we do have some recent experience with Patriot Viper Steel, and we found that they tend not to use the highest quality memory ICs if you get a spec tech IC set, but that is based on our one sample size and we can't comment on the other modules, so do take that with a pinch of salt. What I'm basically saying there is, while the Klevv kit is priced higher than some of those commodity kits that it has to compete with, you do get a guarantee of high quality Hynix ICs, which may be a benefit to some people. And if we look at other quality kits, then the Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 is about the same price at scan. So yeah, okay, I guess Klevv has got a bit of a tough fight there. If we summarize then, the Klevv CRAS XR RGB and Bolt XR are two well-designed 16 GB single rank memory kits. You get a solid performance offering from the 4 GHz Hynix DJR memory ICs, and pricing is around about where we would want it to lie. I'd say the CRAS XR RGB in particular looks quite good at £145 in the UK, and if for whatever reason you don't want to go with Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro, this is most certainly a very valid alternative, and that's especially true if, for example, you want the, like I've said, shorter design, or you just don't fancy using Corsair iQ. So overall, pretty happy with these, but let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I've been Luke Hill for KitGuru. Thank you for watching our video review of Klevv's CRAS XR RGB and Bolt XR 4 GHz 16 GB memory kits. Whew, that was a bit of a mouthful actually. Too many letters, too many names. If you like what we do here at KitGuru, then let us know in the comments section down below. Give us a like and subscribe. Check out the written review on the KitGuru website and interact with us on all the social media channels. And consider buying a cool t-shirt like this one too. I will see you in the next one.